CNBC article here. Just a little update on Uber and Lyft. They're threatening to suspend service in California if they have to classify drivers as employees. That tactic may backfire. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Let's read a little bit of this article and see what the author is talking about. If you're not from California, I don't know if they're doing this in other states. It seems like a totally Californian thing to do, but some legislation was passed. This was many months ago. This was prior to the good old pandemic. But let's read a little bit more. I'm sure they'll talk about that here. Uber and Lyft are running out of options in California. The companies have been fighting to continue classifying their drivers as independent workers, avoiding expenses like healthcare and unemployment insurance for hundreds of thousands of drivers in the state. Last year, they failed to block a bill aimed at classifying gig workers as employees from becoming law. And then, as of Monday, failed to convince a court that the law should not apply to them. And if you recall, gig workers, journalists, or individuals who were websites or newspapers were impacted by this as well. Now, while pledging to appeal the court's ruling on a preliminary injunction requiring them to reclassify drivers, Uber and Lyft are turning to voters as a last resort. On Wednesday, executives at both companies raised the stakes by threatening to suspend service in California if they can't get their way. It's what happens, right? If a company can't remain profitable somewhere, then they owe us no obligation to stay in business. Though I do enjoy riding Uber and Lyft. It's a great convenience, especially when going to the airport. Seems like I won't need to go to the airport anytime soon, but both stated in court filings that outcome would practically be inevitable in order to restructure their operations if enforcement of the injunction isn't further postponed. The companies would likely come back eventually, but it could take until at least November when voters decide their fate at the polls. Uber and Lyft have each poured $30 million into a ballot measure called Proposition 22, which would exempt drivers for app-based ride-hailing and food delivery services from the employee classification required under the new state law, Assembly Bill 5, AB 5. Food service as well. I've never used that, probably never would, so that's not a big deal for me. And honestly, I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it because I hadn't used it. But let's read a little more here. That's a risky move for the money-losing ride-hailing companies whose revenue has suffered during the pandemic. On one hand, Uber and Lyft may stand to gain from a temporary shutdown if voters realize how much they miss their services by November and vote yes on the proposition. With ridership already down, the companies won't miss out on their usual revenue. Anyway, on the other hand, Californians who are already fed up with corporate tactics and have a newfound appreciation for workers laboring through the pandemic may decide Uber and Lyft should just follow the law as written. Riders and drivers could direct their anger towards the companies if they view them as abandoning the state in the midst of a crisis. Analysts already see drivers as one of the biggest obstacles keeping Uber and Lyft from reaching profitability. If voters decide the companies should compensate workers as employees and become subject to other employer costs like payroll taxes, Uber and Lyft will have to rethink their entire business models or be forced to leave the biggest state in the country. Wouldn't that be something if California led the way to these companies eventually going into some kind of downward spiral? It could go one of two ways, right? Voters could side with Uber and Lyft, and this could all be forgotten about by next year. But if voters vote against Uber and Lyft, then perhaps it does go that way, and Uber and Lyft just stay out of California, period. And possibly that could open the door for another player. You know how it is, right? When there's a vacuum in any market, somebody could come in. Although the startup costs and barriers to entry are really high here in terms of dealing with California itself and just the costs, it seems like, of even trying to get a company like this off the ground. One thing I would say, and I don't give stock advice at all, so don't listen to me, but I wouldn't want to own stock in either of these two companies right now. Uber and Lyft did not provide statements directly on this article, but pointed to court filings asking a judge to delay the reclassification for at least the extent of their appeal. The trial judge rejected that request, leaving the companies with about a week left on the stay, unless the appellate court says otherwise. All right, so we're going to have to follow this story and follow up on this appellate court decision also. Uber also pointed to a past statement on the preliminary injunction and blog posts about the likely impact of reclassification. Lyft pointed to an email sent to drivers Thursday outlining similar points, as well as comments by drivers advocating for voters to support the ballot measure to help them maintain flexible work hours. And that's what Uber and Lyft need to do. Just reading that, bottom line right there. They need the drivers to be the face of this bill. They don't need a corporation beating them over the head with, hey, this is why you've got to do this, this is what we need, this is the help we need for the drivers, blah, blah, blah. No, we need the actual drivers to be the face of this. So something like, and I'm not saying they aren't doing this, but something like an online campaign on these sites. An online campaign, social media campaign, focused on the drivers. Actual drivers getting the word out to potential voters in California. That'd be the best course of action, as far as I can see it. Driver preference, this is important here. When challenged over their classification of drivers as contractors, the first line of defense Uber and Lyft always invoke is that drivers prefer it that way. A 2020 survey of 734 app-based drivers conducted by the independent blog The Rideshare Guy found that more than 71% preferred being classified as independent workers. That's high, but not as high as the survey the same blog conducted prior to the pandemic, when more than 81% of the nearly 1,000 respondents said they preferred to be independent workers. Pandemic creates a situation where these individuals want safety. I get it. But critics, including Silicon Valley rep Ro Khanna, apparently that's a person, Democrat from California, say drivers really want the flexibility that Uber and Lyft have unfairly claimed would be diminished under an employee model. The reality is that you can be a part-time driver and still be an employee. You can still have flexibility and still be an employee, Kahana said in a phone interview Thursday. There's no justification for not treating these drivers as employees. Again, government officials thinking they know what's best for the people, even though the people may seem to disagree. People, I should say drivers. In the earlier Rideshare Guy survey, pay and flexibility were most important to drivers, but labor experts say there's no reason flexibility and employment status should be diametrically opposed. They kind of use this rhetoric to create a zero-sum equation, said Aaron Hatton, a sociology professor at the University of Buffalo, who has studied labor and the gig economy. We can construct all sorts of jobs to give workers more autonomy in the workplace. You don't have to be an independent contractor to do so. You don't have to be an independent contractor to have some flexibility in your hours that you work. They're using this rhetoric to really kind of skirt unemployment law and decrease their obligation to workers and to the state. While Uber and Lyft provide a way for workers to earn extra cash on their own schedule, Hatton said it doesn't afford the level of freedom many initially expect. Yes, many workers, I think I know where we're going with this. Let's see if I'm right. Yes, many workers do crave to be entrepreneurs, and they may very well be lured by the promise of that. But what we tend to see is that over time, they realize that that is sort of a false promise, she said. In order to support families, there it is. That's exactly where I thought it was going. These jobs don't actually offer the control and autonomy and decent wages. That's what I thought they were going to go to, was the wages itself. They seem to promise. And it's exactly where I was thinking it was going to go. I thought that because it's the democratic nature of things. It seems to be something to do with their party, their mentality. Their solution to everything is more, more, more. Higher wages solves everything. And in reality, that's not. Because all that does is really create this whole kind of, I don't know if I'd call it like a snowball effect, but more like a black hole effect, maybe, on the entire economy. When people start getting paid more, what happens everywhere else? Inflation, gentrification, I guess, in a way. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but the solution isn't always a higher wage. A higher wage isn't always going to solve everyone's problems. I know I'm just kind of glossing over it here a little bit, Democrats never seem to know when to say when. Oh, we always had this march for $15 an hour. And I always thought that was hypocritical because on that side of the aisle, they always seem to want to allow an increasing number of individuals into our labor pool, if you know what I mean, a little something along the southern border. So they were willing to allow tons of more people into our labor pool, but yet at the same time, pay people more. And it would be a simple matter of supply and demand. The less individuals we have competing for the same number of jobs, wages should rise. The more people you have coming in, trying to apply for those jobs, yeah. Oh, I know the argument. They're doing the job that Americans won't do. Sure. They're doing those jobs because companies know they're able to pay depressed wages because of the increased demand in applicants for that particular job. Come on, get it together. Supply and demand. You want more money for people per hour. Oh yeah, let's give people everything. Let's give them everything. It's so easy to say give them everything. But at the same time, you're not willing to depress the demand on the labor market. Pay everybody more. It's such a simple solution, right? It's just so easy. Let's just pay everybody more. These are just talking points for the Democratic Party. They just don't know how to think. I don't understand it. I know I'm simplifying things, but the solution isn't always more in terms of money. You have to look at all the other things going on around that as well. When Nicole Moore began driving for Lyft a couple nights a week, she began to incur additional costs like replacement tires and insurance for her now high-mileage car. She would have needed insurance anyway, but the cash in your pocket is not what you're actually making, said Moore, who's an activist. There we go, another activist. With Rideshare Drivers United, which has pushed for Uber and Lyft to reclassify drivers. Uber and Lyft have said reclassifying drivers as employees would place a large burden on their operations and therefore limit their ability to provide drivers with the same flexible schedules they do now. And I'll just read this one last paragraph. I'll archive this, of course, in the description if you want to read the rest. The ballot measure Lyft and Uber are supporting would entitle workers to some protections like healthcare subsidies, vehicle insurance, and minimum earnings. In arguments before the court prior to the injunction, Lyft's lawyer said the protections under Proposition 22 do not place the same burden on businesses as employment status because the latter requires huge administrative changes, including processing employment documents, it's true, hiring HR staff, and implementing a system to manage and track hours worked. And all of that is true as well, added costs. Interesting, right? Now, in spite of my rant earlier, I'm all good with people working harder to make more money. That's what it's all about. And every time we're in an Uber or Lyft, you always talk to the driver and just get a feel for things and how things are going. And obviously this was pre-pandemic. A lot of them talked about how Uber and Lyft really cut down on what they were able to make. They were saying things basically seemed to get cut like 20%, 30, 40% in terms of what they would take home. They would say, oh yeah, I worked 30 hours per week in the past and I would make $500, for example. I'm just throwing it out there. But now, I work 30 hours a week and now I only end up getting $350. I have to work longer to get what I got before. I shouldn't say hours, but more like fares and miles driven and stuff like that. So from that sense, that's one thing that I would see as the battleground. I don't drive myself, obviously, so I've got no skin in the game, but in terms of the battleground for me, I think it's the drivers versus Lyft and Uber in terms of getting those rates per mile, or however they parse out the money, but getting those rates back up to levels they were at before. Now, I get that Uber and Lyft have to get to profitability to stay in business, right? Because investors only, they want to see a return eventually. Again, to me, that's the battleground. It seems like once you get these legislators involved, you're going down a whole road that really, I think, would drag the company down in the long run. So rather than these legislators trying to put all of these extra conditions upon Uber and Lyft that maybe aren't practical and maybe aren't going to help them ever get to profitability and eventually lead them to going out of business, that perhaps the pressure should be there to increase the wages for drivers. And that would be something that I think that drivers could really get behind, and I think people in the public would probably get behind that as well. And I say that because I think whenever you get into the car, and this is just my experience, most of the time you talk to the drivers and they're pretty decent people, right? You just BS with them, take it to the airport, talking about a 30, 40-minute ride each way. So yeah, you get to know people a little bit, have a good conversation, and most of them seem to be pretty decent people. So I think that from the driver's perspective, that's probably something that they want to look at pursuing more so than backing something like this. But we'll see where things go in November, and we'll see what happens with the appellate court decision coming up. We assume that's going to be the next week or two. So thanks for watching, everybody. Let me know what you think. Take it easy.